Welcome to Politics and More. I'm Jeff Rowan. Let me start out this vlog by saying that I have great respect for the Pew Research Center. I thought they did a really good job polling during the 2012 election. That being said, that out of the way, I believe that their recent published report that MSNBC has 15% hard news and 85% opinion on its network is at best useless and at worst completely misleading. And I'd like to use this vlog to point out why that's the case. That report, that statistic, by the way, not surprisingly gave rise to a flurry of reports in the news and in the blogosphere saying, oh my God, MSNBC is even more biased than I thought. And look, Fox does much better. They have a much higher hard news content. Let me explain why that's meaningless. First of all, I have no idea what the methodology of the Pew Center was, because often hard news and opinion sort of flow imperceptibly into one another. So coding one from the other is difficult. But let's take a hypothetical example just to show the problems with research of this sort. Suppose you tune into the NBC Nightly News, and they're doing a story on a speech that the president just gave. It's a 4-minute story. A correspondent opens up the speech with a brief intro. 4 excerpts from the speech are presented. The reporter buttons up the speech, and the report ends, and they move on to a different story. So let's say then you turn to MSNBC. And because NBC and MSNBC are, of course, sister stations, you have that very same report on MSNBC. Same reporter, same 4 excerpts, same 4 minutes. You watch it. But after it ends, then what you get is 4 more minutes of roundtable discussion on MSNBC. Now, how do you code that exactly? Is the takeaway from that, NBC has 100% hard news, but MSNBC has only 50% hard news and 50% opinion? Well, I guess that's one way to code it, but is that really to suggest that the story that you got on NBC was superior to what you got on MSNBC? Actually, they provided the same story. The difference was, on MSNBC, you get a roundtable discussion with some commentary and some context and some discussion, some evaluation of the speech. Now, whether you prefer the MSNBC version or the NBC version is really a matter of taste. It's a matter of personal preference. Whether you'd rather get the bare bones or get a broader presentation of the president's speech is really up to you. But to infer from 50% versus 100% that one presentation is better than the other, I think is meaningless. Not only that, but if I, as I would tend to do, if I would prefer the MSNBC version, during that roundtable discussion, I may get some fact-checking. I may get a comparison of this speech of the president versus some earlier speech that he gave. I may get a comparison of this president versus another president. There may be all manner of information that comes to me from the roundtable discussion, and I can draw enormous insight from that. I mean, there's a reason why every 1-hour Sunday talk show, Meet the Press, ABC's This Week, Fox News Sunday, they all basically have the same format now, which is a half-hour of newsmaker interview and a half-hour of roundtable discussion. Basically because they want to give some commentary, some context, and some understanding of the issues after they present some hard news to you. Not to mention that roundtable discussions are somewhat entertaining. There's nothing wrong with that either. News doesn't have to be painful to absorb. But to make my point further, let me take another example. let's go back to what many regard as one of the golden chapters of journalism, and that is the coverage of the civil rights struggle in the early 1960s. What happened in the 60s was that some of the greatest journalists of their generation flocked down to Mississippi and Arkansas and Alabama to cover the events of the day. So you had Mike Wallace there, and you had Tom Brokaw there, and you had Jack Nelson there, and you had Dan Rather covering those events. And what happened? Well, once those reporters got there, they were absolutely reviled by Southerners in particular, and the right wing in specific, saying that they were biased, they were commie, pinko, left-wing, end-loving, northern carpetbaggers who were down there to destroy the Southern way of life. Now, the more polite critics of these reporters simply said that they were Eastern establishment liberals. Well, you know what? I actually agree. I think that those reporters did have a bias. It was a bias in favor of justice and fairness and tolerance and democracy and egalitarianism. And they carried that bias, those values with them in every story that they filed from the South, and shone an important light on what was going on. And history has validated that bias, those values, 1,000 times over since those reports were filed. That's why it's one of the golden ages of journalism. And you know what? If those same reporters had gone over to the Soviet Union in 1962, 63, 64, and had revealed human rights abuses in the then Soviet Union, abuses against dissidents, abuses against Soviet Jewry, abuses against women, abuses against satellite countries, the same people who were criticizing them for uncovering problems in the United States would be praising them for finding problems in the Soviet Union. So people who criticize their values for reporting here would have extolled them for finding problems elsewhere. Now, I've brought up the fact that these values have been validated by history. And you know why that is? Because history itself has a liberal perspective. History is a liberal light that shines back on the events of the past, because it takes place in the future and is involved in looking back a day or a week or a year or 100 years and determining which historical actors were involved in the grand project of creating a more perfect union. And if you were engaged in that project, history will hold you in high regard. That is, if in 1948 you signed an executive order that integrated the armed forces, history is going to praise you greatly. And when Harry Truman did that in 1948, his executive order integrating the armed forces was so unpopular that his Secretary of the Army resigned a year later because he refused to implement that executive order. Not only that, but as we all know, when Truman left office in 1953, he had the lowest approval ratings of any president at that time in the polling era. Now, what happened? Well, history had other ideas about Harry Truman. History has resurrected him, it has elevated him, and now if you look at a wide range of historical surveys on the greatest presidents, he ranks in the top 10 of all U.S. presidents. It's interesting the way history works. On the other hand, if you stood in the doorway at the University of Mississippi when James Meredith was trying to integrate it, or if you blocked Vivian Malone from entering the University of Alabama, or worse, if you were standing on the sidelines shouting obscenities at 10 young students as they tried to integrate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, history holds you in very low regard. The reason for that is history embodies those same values that those civil rights journalists embodied: fairness, justice, tolerance, democracy, egalitarianism. Those are the values that by which history judges individuals. So the point that I'm trying to make with all this is that it doesn't matter whether your network has 15% opinion, 40% opinion, or 70% opinion. The issue is, what's the quality of the opinion that your network is offering? It's the level of insight, it's the level of vision, it's the values that come out of that particular journalistic organ that are important, not some raw statistic. So please spare me the shorthand ways of evaluating cable news networks. Simply tallying up somebody's hard news content tells you absolutely nothing about the quality of that station. Looking qualitatively at the performance, which is much harder to do, obviously, is what tells you whether a cable news station is good or not. Now, in closing this vlog, I'd like to offer a little passage from Dan Rather. Rather, in 1998, was asked to give a set of reflections on his coverage decades earlier of the civil rights struggle. And he was invited to the John F. Kennedy Center to talk about the civil rights movement from the 60s. He talked about Martin Luther King. And let me read you a passage that he offered about Martin Luther King that I found really compelling. Dan Rather said, "I miss him, to tell you the truth. I miss the sound of his voice and the things he said with that voice. I miss the choir that resounded with him when he lifted that voice, because Dr. King was a leader, not a soloist. I haven't heard another voice quite like it, and I travel around the United States now listening for another voice, and I don't hear it yet. His choir endures, but without its choir master. And so we may hear a phrase from that same song, yes, a peep here and a booming crescendo there, but we don't hear his voice. And I know we are all the poorer, yes, and all the more foolish, because we no longer hear that voice." And as I read that quote from Dan Rather, I thought, wow, I wish every reporter carried that same bias with him. I'm Jeff Rowan. I'll see you next time.